The Garden of Four Voices. In a river town wreathed by bamboo and lacquered rooftops, there was a courtyard that every resident called, without grandiosity, the Garden of Four Voices. Its stone path braided between a tea house, a scholar's chamber, a carpenter's shed, and a small riverside stall where a woman wove ribbons into charms. Each place held a voice: the scholar's precise murmur, the tea master's slow bell, the carpenter's measured hammer song, and the weaver's quick, bright laugh. They were called the Four by the townsfolk, not for any formal kinship, but because their rhythms, like four notes in a scale, shaped the attention of anyone who walked the lane. One spring morning, a young student arrived from the Highlands. He had read many books and practiced calligraphy until his fingers cramped, but his understanding of speech and meaning felt thin as paper. He sought instruction not in rote learning, but in the way words lived in the world, how a question opened a gate, how silence could carry a reply, and how stories made room for contradictions. The scholar invited him to sit beneath the courtyard's osmanthus and watch. "Observe," the scholar said, pouring tea and setting the cup between them. "Words are tools and ruins. They build and they erode. If you insist on a single truth, you will never learn the contours of compromise." They listened first to the tea master who, with a bamboo scoop, measured leaves like a craftsman measuring timber. He spoke of patience. "Tea asks that you wait," he explained, "and in that waiting you meet yourself, as when a river spends itself on pebbles and becomes clear." The student noticed how the tea master's voice did not assert but invited. His sentences bent like willow branches. They let meaning hang, delicate and visible. The carpenter, returning from the river with a plank balanced on his shoulder, put down his tool and tapped two deliberate rhythms on the wood. "There is propriety in measure," he said. "If a beam is too thick, the frame is clumsy. If too thin, it will fail. Speech, like timber, must weigh its load." He taught the student that precision was not pedantry, but a discipline that honored function and beauty together. At dusk, the weaver unrolled strips of dyed silk and began to braid. Her hands moved faster than thought as she told a short tale of a market argument settled by sharing a hot bun. "We do not resolve by proving the other wrong," she said, "but by making room so both can eat." The student realized that cadence and warmth could disarm stubbornness. That language laced itself into action and mending. Over weeks, the student learned to hear the garden's grammar. He began to practice a new kind of speech, a sentence that paused to see who listened, a question that expected more than a single answer. He came to understand that language in the garden acted less as a mirror of certainty and more as a loom where people could weave provisional designs for living. One evening, a merchant arrived, loud and confident, dragging a carriage full of foreign goods and words unfamiliar to the town's tongue. He criticized the common measures, mocked their teapots as quaint, and insisted the only path to prosperity was to replicate his method exactly. "Customs are obstacles," he declared. "We must standardize and streamline." The scholar raised an eyebrow and asked, "And what do you mean by prosperity?" The merchant scoffed, naming coffers and coins. The tea master poured a cup for the merchant with hands unchanged. The carpenter tapped his plank, then spoke. "If a house resists the rain but suffocates its inhabitants, which prosperity do you choose? If your method makes one town rich and another barren, we call that imbalance." The merchant, who believed in the power of overwhelming assertion, pressed on. He called for a vote to adopt his measures wholesale. The town divided briefly, some enticed by unfamiliar promises, some fearful of losing small certainties. The student felt the atmosphere tighten like a string about to break. It was the weaver who suggested a test. She proposed that each system be tried for a season. One lane would use the merchant's measures, another would keep the old ways, a third would blend them. The town agreed, not because they feared the merchant, but because the proposal reframed the debate. It turned a conflict of identity into an experiment about living together. During the trial, the lane that adopted the merchant's standards found unexpected gain in trade, but also an increase in laborers who felt estranged. The lane that remained unchanged preserved its rhythms, but slowed in commerce. The blended lane, awkward at first, required new negotiations, changes in pottery, different spoons, new counts for weighing rice, but it also fostered a vocabulary for compromise, new words coined by townspeople to describe shared practices. The student observed the value of a moderated dialectic. He watched neighbors bring grievances to a weekly bench where voices were limited to measured sentences. They learned to ask questions that began with, "How might we?" rather than, "Why won't you?" Over time, the town halved its sharp edges and doubled its curiosity. Language had become a craft for balancing interests, not a weapon for crushing them. One clear morning, the student was offered the place of an apprentice to the scholar. He accepted, but with a condition: to spend a year learning beside each of the four, to set wood with the carpenter, to gauge tea with the master, to weave ribbons, and to debate in the scholar's study. The elder smiled and agreed. Years folded on themselves like pages. The student's prose deepened. His metaphors became less florid and more exact. He wrote treatises not to condemn, but to propose, to stitch philosophical observation to ordinary practice. He taught his pupils to listen to voices different from their own and to discover how a single thought, when softened and reforged, might hold more than one life at once. The merchant, seeing that his fortune did not require the eradication of difference, learned to value the slow art of compromise. He began to invest in apprentices who learned both counting and courtesy. The town's prosperity grew, not as an edict, but as a mosaic, and its songs added a new harmony, four voices, still distinct, now calibrated to one another. On a late afternoon, decades after the student first arrived, he walked the stone path beneath the same osmanthus. A younger scholar asked him, "Master, what is the secret of speaking well?" The old student, now older in years, but not in curiosity, looked at the sash of sunlight across the courtyard and answered, "To speak well is to live in the interval between certainty and wonder. It is to make words that can be used as bridges, not as walls." He did not promise final answers. He spoke only of practice, patience, and the everyday work of listening. Around them, the garden continued. Tea leaves were measured, timber struck a steady rhythm, silk braided, and voices rose and fell like tides. No ending sealed their lives. Instead, the town kept its doors open to new voices, treating every arrival as an invitation to test, to revise, and to learn how language could be a shared instrument for living more gently together. Vocabulary. Introspection, the examination of one's own thoughts and feelings. He engaged in daily introspection to understand why certain phrases made him uneasy. Cadence, the rhythmic flow of a sequence of sounds or words. The speaker's cadence lent gravity to the simple proverb. Propriety, conformity to established standards of behavior or manners. She corrected the sentence with propriety, mindful of tone and audience. Dialectic, a method of argument that resolves disagreement through reasoned exchange. Their dialectic revealed subtleties neither side had anticipated. Provisional, temporary, and subject to revision. The committee issued a provisional guideline pending further observation. They worked to harmonize competing schedules so the festival could proceed. Proceed. Cadre, a small group trained for a particular purpose. A cadre of apprentices learned both carpentry and rhetoric. Nuance, a subtle distinction or variation. He appreciated the nuance in the elder's response. Reciprocity, the practice of exchanging things with others for mutual benefit. Reciprocity between traders fostered long-term alliances. Measured, deliberate, and restrained in action or speech. Her measured reply diffused the argument before it escalated. Syncretized, to combine different beliefs or practices into a coherent whole. They attempted to syncretize new trade methods with traditional rites. Equanimity, mental calmness, and composure, especially in difficult situations. He received criticism with surprising equanimity. Camaraderie, mutual trust and friendship among people who spend time together. The workshop's camaraderie made heavy labor feel meaningful. Heuristic, serving as an aid to learning, discovery, or problem-solving. The trial period functioned as a heuristic for policy refinement. Ephemeral, lasting for a very short time. The festival's joy was ephemeral, but its lessons endured. Meticulous, showing great attention to detail. The carpenter's meticulous measurements ensured the beam fit snugly. Pragmatic, dealing with things sensibly and realistically. The town adopted a pragmatic approach to resolving disputes. Modulate, to adjust or regulate intensity, tone, or pitch. She learned to modulate her voice when addressing younger listeners. Convivial, friendly, lively, and enjoyable. Even debates at the bench retained a convivial atmosphere. Synthesis, the combination of ideas to form a coherent whole. Their synthesis of methods produced a practice both efficient and humane.